I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report from a historic and gaffe-ridden NATO summit. We bring you the latest news from Ukraine.
And finally, you'll be hearing from me, Danielle Sheridan, the Telegraph's defence editor, about my exclusive interview with Olena Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 12th of July, 2 years and 144 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined in the studio by Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, and Defence Editor Danielle Sheridan. In Washington, D.C., we hear from Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, and calling in from Berlin, we hear our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell. I started by asking Joe for the latest news from the NATO summit in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it was incredible. Here's Joe Biden. You've got 24 allies with him, Ukrainian President Zelensky. I think Charles Michel was there representing the EU. And they're basically celebrating the fact that they've all signed these bilateral security deals with Ukraine. And Biden gave basically a word-for-word perfect speech. Yes, he was reading off an auto cue, a prompter. But apart from a bit of murmuring, which you get from anyone, me included, it was perfect. And then suddenly, he goes to introduce President Zelensky and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin." And at that point, I would like to say you could hear a pin drop. I was watching from a big television screen in the larger press room. There were audible gasps. I think I heard someone literally drop their coffee and go, "Oh my God, he's done it again." It was just incredible. There aren't words for it, because until that point, the spectre of Biden's health had hung over the summit. And the domestic context of his battle against Donald Trump was a big, big issue. And European diplomats, American diplomats, they spent hours, months working on this summit to make it a success, make sure it demonstrates absolute unity, it delivers something for Ukraine that is seen as positive. And everyone was of the mind that had happened until this moment. It literally was a flick of the switch, less than 10 seconds. The summit basically was flipped on its head, and the narrative was completely changed from what was a successful NATO summit to a summit marred by Joe Biden's gaffe. So I was writing last night that basically after this came the national press conferences. Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, they went on stage and defended Biden over the slip of the tongue and said, look, it can happen to anyone. Keir Starmer was asked, I think, about 4 times by UK journalists if he thought Biden was still up to the job, if he thought he was the right man to lead NATO. And basically Starmer went, look, you've got to give this guy credit. He has led us through this really successful NATO summit. And look, everything has happened because of his leadership. So I guess they were trying to kill it. But they're going to be deeply, deeply frustrated at this, because it's taking away from their moment to control the messaging in their own country, to point out the positives, their contributions, etc., etc. But no, it became about Joe Biden and his gaffe. So I was roaming the corridors of the summit after this happened, speaking to someone. I actually managed to bump into someone who was in the crowd, and they described the events, and they just said, look, it was awful. It was very bad. But I think the general consensus amongst diplomats and officials who I spoke to were that it was essentially this moment, their hard work was going to go absolutely unnoticed, because on the front pages, on all of the news channels, Joe Biden's gaffe is going to be the headline. So it's taken the focus away from what has been a great summit for us, so someone told me. And it's just incredible. And then it only got worse. Joe Biden goes to give his national press conference, which is the traditional end of a NATO summit. The US president stands up and basically ends the summit. And he then referred to Kamala Harris as Vice President Trump, which again, and I was sat next to our US editor, Tony Diver, opposite, and we were just looking at each other going, oh my God, it's happened again. Like, what is going on? It's interesting because for probably 95% of his press conference, he delivered a few mumbles, few murmurs, but he delivered some really complex messages off the cuff on foreign policy, about Gaza, about various bits of American sort of domestic policy that I won't pretend to understand. But he was in like fighting spirit. But he's going to be absolutely overshadowed by these two moments of sort of slips of the tongue, because it's just going to damage his credibility. It damages the standing and overshadows the NATO summit. It was a really incredible and strange moment to be a part of.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, you said other than that, it was a successful summit for NATO. Just before we go to Francis for some reaction, what are your takeaways from the last few days?
Yeah, so look, at the preparations ahead of the summit, they were looking at Trump-proofing NATO. So what Roland was speaking about yesterday. And they successfully thought they had done that. They had gone from 3 allies in 2014 hitting the 2% target to announcing that there was 23 allies hitting that target, and other allies were making plans to hit those targets in the near future or a few years or whatever. So that's one tick box. They managed to avoid a full-on Zelensky meltdown. If you cast your mind back to Vilnius in Lithuania, after Zelensky and Ukraine weren't given an invitation to NATO, he went on Telegram and on Twitter and called NATO absurd. And Zelensky was able to arrive at the summit, speak to the leaders, address and say, look, I've got these concerns, but ultimately I'm happy because we've got all this air defence. We've got commitments that our Western allies are with us for the long term. And ultimately, we've got this irreversible path to NATO. So that diplomacy that we've been speaking about had been a success. And all overshadowed by Joe Biden introducing President Zelensky as President Putin.
Thank you very much, Joe, for joining us. Francis, can I come to you? Your reaction?
Well, thanks, David. It's fascinating to hear Joe's reaction on the ground in Washington. It is hard to overstate the impact here, whether justified or not, in London and many other Western capitals. The spotlight was on Biden, and he failed to show that he can function without a teleprompter in a manner that could see him as a viable candidate for another 4 years in office. And I think that's the key thing here. We're not just talking about the short term, we're talking about another 4 years. One could almost feel the power draining away from his presidency at the moment. That op-ed in the New York Times by George Clooney that said he was not the same Joe Biden was devastating. Evidently, there is something of a orchestrated attempt within the Democratic Party now, the Democratic establishment, to get Biden to stand down. But even if he does, and that's a big if, have they left it too late? We tend to forget, those of us who are watching politics very closely, that replacing a candidate, building the stature, can take months when you have populations who are not as politically engaged constantly as journalists, and no doubt our listeners are obliged and feel strongly they want to be. And so this is a pivotal moment. To give you a sense of the anger in NATO, Joe quoted there some of the conversations he's had on the ground, and that line that it's taken the focus away from the summit, I think rings true given the international reaction that I've been reading this morning. Now, I'll talk later about what further was actually agreed in those 3 days and its implications for Ukraine. But we have to focus on Biden first, because he is, after all, the symbolic head of the free world. And this is now a full-blown crisis. I think that's fair to say. Frankly, for many, it's been quite obvious for some time that he's not been in a position that would see him as a viable candidate for another 4 years. I remember we talked in March about the special counsel's findings, which described his memory as hazy, fuzzy, faulty, poor, noting that he couldn't recall defining milestones in his own life, such as his son's death or when he served as VP. There was little to no comment at the time from senior Democrats. And yet now it seems that everybody is almost jumping over their seats to be saying that enough is enough. Western leaders themselves, of course, as well, and this is something I think that's underappreciated, are in some ways being implicated or feeling implicated in this conspiracy of silence, which puts them in a sensitive diplomatic position. The new British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, for instance, was asked yesterday by journalists whether Biden was sharp in his conversations with him, and he said that he was on good form. But one has to wonder how these kinds of defences of President Biden are being read in the Trump camp, who may well be the successor and won't take too kindly to it being seen as a conspiracy by Western leaders to keep Biden in office, or indeed by the West's enemies, who will no doubt know the precarious situation that President Biden is in through their own intelligence networks. Now, the demands on any Western leader are unimaginably intense. Just read the latest interview in Reuters about Zelensky, which gives one a sense of how sleep deprived he is and how he can never switch off. He's quite candid in the interview, the president. But no one can blame anyone for having off days. But when it becomes a consistent narrative, you're in very, very deep trouble. And ultimately, the White House has been unable to prove that the president is in a fit position to continue even in the short term. And as I said the other day, the fact is that even if President Biden is extremely capable, extremely effective, politics is about perception at the end of the day. Whether somebody is an efficient leader, a capable leader, mentally fit to be a leader, and ultimately an effective leader. And we're in the situation now where I think that narrative has been lost or is very, very near to being lost by the White House. And that will mean that we will be in a very precarious moment indeed. So a lot to consider, David.
Thank you very much, Joe and Francis. I mean, in this podcast, we try to start every single podcast with updates from Ukraine, but this absolutely felt so important and so unavoidable that we did have to start with it, because who knows what might happen in the coming days, the coming weeks, and how that might change and impact the West's support and position on Ukraine. Dom Nicholls, can you bring us the latest news from Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks, David, and hi, team. So Russian attacks across Ukraine in the last 24 hours killed at least 7, injured over 40, children amongst the casualties. The attacks that caused the casualties were in Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Kyiv, Kherson and Sumy oblasts. That comes from regional authorities earlier today. There were also strikes in Chernihiv, Kyiv, Luhansk, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia Oblast, but no casualties reported from there. Ukrainian air defences say they shot down all 5 Kh-101 cruise missiles targeting Starokostyantyniv air base in Khmelnytsky Oblast. That's midway, it's right over in the west, midway between Kyiv and Lviv, so about 200 kilometres equidistant from both. The Air Force says it also shot down 11 of 19 Shahed drones launched overnight. Those attacks, or certainly on the airbase out to the west, it's likely this continued pattern we've seen, this uptick in the last few weeks of Russia attempting to hit air bases where they think F-16s either are or are likely to operate from. So we will see more of that. Just draw your attention to today's British Defence Intelligence update. We've covered this before and regularly, but it is worth just noting, just tracking the casualty figures. Very difficult to get Ukrainian casualty figures, but we think the figures that are reported about Russia is reasonably accurate. You've got to take a pinch of salt, but reasonably accurate. Today's Defence Intelligence update says the average daily Russian casualties, which they say is killed and wounded, I would also include missing and surrendered, but they say killed and wounded, average daily number of Russian casualties throughout May and June increased to, as they say, conflict highs of 1,262 in May, 1,163 in June. I mean, really very specific figures. So there's going to be a fudge factor there slightly, but those are very high figures. DI said, Defence Intelligence say, in total, Russia has likely lost. Remember, on their probability yardstick, likely is 55 to 75%. So likely lost in excess of 70,000 personnel in the last 2 months alone. They've ascribed this uptick to the new front Russia tried to open up in Kharkiv over the border there in the Volchansk area, whilst also trying to maintain the same rate of offensive operations in the east. And all that's happened is that they've ground ahead in the east. They're being pushed back in the north, but taking a huge number of casualties in so doing. Now then, a couple more from me. The permission for Ukraine to strike inside Russia with Danish-supplied F-16s will depend on the circumstances. That comes from Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen. She was speaking to RFE, Radio Free Europe, when asked about the matter by a journalist on the margins of the NATO summit in Washington. Mette Frederiksen said, "You can't put that question and expect simple answers because it all depends on the circumstances. It has to be according to international law, but it is possible also to reach targets outside Ukraine, yes." So pretty, nuanced, but also relatively clear, if you can have the two of those. So just as a reminder, in addition to the 19 F-16s promised by Denmark, there's another 60 due to come from the Netherlands, Belgium and Norway. Just on weapon pledges, the US yesterday promised the next security package for Ukraine. This is the drawdown from the $61 billion. This one's going to be worth $225 million, said to include a Patriot missile battery and additional HIMARS ammunition, plus a few other bits and bobs. And then just finally for me, the UN General Assembly yesterday passed a vote demanding that Russia, quote, urgently withdraw its military and other unauthorized personnel, unquote, from Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The 193-member General Assembly adopted the resolution, 99 votes in favour, 9 against, 60 abstentions. You'll remember the Zaporizhzhia plant, which is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, captured by Russia shortly after the start of the full-scale invasion. It's currently shut down but needs external power to keep the nuclear material cool. Speaking after the vote, Ukraine's UN Ambassador Sergei Kyslytsa urged countries to vote in favour of the resolution, saying, "We owe this to future generations. We must ensure that the horrors of nuclear disasters are not repeated." Now, as we've reported, since the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine and Russia have accused each other of shelling the plant and smashing up all the power lines. Ukraine has recently dismissed Russian accusations, again saying that it had been attacking the plant. The UN resolution calls for, quote, immediate cessation of the attacks by the Russian Federation against critical energy infrastructure of Ukraine, which increase the risk of a nuclear accident or incident at all nuclear facilities of Ukraine. Now then, Deputy Russian UN Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky told the General Assembly ahead of the vote that the resolution was, in his words, to try to promote the false Western narrative about the source of threats to nuclear facilities in Ukraine. But I think it was fairly unequivocal what the vote was for and the numbers in favour of it. Whether or not that would make any difference, we don't know. But I'd point folks to the interview that Roland did with Emmanuel Grossi, the head of the UN nuclear watchdog, which we carried a few days ago and was in print, I think, last weekend. And that's us up to date, David.
Thank you very much, Dom, for all of those updates. Francis, can I come to you? Aside from Biden, what were the other updates from the NATO summit that stood out for you?
Well, thanks, David. So Biden aside, what was actually agreed at the summit? So 23 of its 32 states have now hit the spending goals of 2% of GDP on defence, with more setting out plans to reach the figure. That's a noteworthy progression from where we were before the war, and indeed is part of that strategy of Trump-proofing NATO, because of course Trump has been so critical of the amount of money that America is spending on effectively the rest of NATO's defence. So I think NATO is trying to, in a sense, get itself into a position where it cannot be criticised for that fact. What else? Zelensky too left Washington with considerable levels of support shown by NATO, despite not being handed a formal invitation to the alliance. As Joe mentioned earlier on, the Americans have put in months of groundwork to avoid the upset caused by Vilnius. And so clearly, Ukraine feels that it is receiving more support and a clearer bridge to one day becoming a member of NATO, but nothing really tangible, at least not publicly. Now, the funding levels agreed are, as I say, considerable. And there was a clear message of lasting, and that's key, lasting support for Kyiv. So the Ukraine Compact, which is the security framework signed by the 32 allies, was the most significant development, creating a unified and comprehensive security architecture to support Ukraine today and in the future, in war and in peace. That's how a White House press briefing put it. The compact states that members will support Ukraine's defence needs through training, military aid and economic assistance, whilst also accelerating Ukraine's efforts to strengthen its defence capabilities. Signatories also agreed to convene swiftly and collectively at the most senior levels to determine appropriate next steps in the event that Russia launches a future armed attack against Ukraine. So some security guarantees there, but perhaps not as concrete as will be required in the long run. In the short term, it goes on, we will continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons, ammunition and training necessary to repel Russian forces. In the medium term, we will help build the forces and capabilities to defend Ukraine and defer future aggression. Those are the remarks of Biden when launching this yesterday. It will have an impact evidently. But one has to wonder whether this goes far enough. And in that sense, I think it is important to consider the alternatives that are no doubt being considered, but which have not been put forward. So Emmy Sarot wrote a fascinating piece for Foreign Affairs reflecting on this, positing how Ukraine may one day join the alliance in the near future, or at least in the medium term, if the alliance were to think more creatively and flexibly. Now, to quote this piece, she writes, "History provides answers and precedents as to how to grant membership to divided states, even one on the front line. These historical models aren't a perfect fit, but it's time to consider these models seriously." She goes on, "There's room for creativity, because although NATO's 1949 founding treaty does obligate allies to treat an attack on one as an attack on all, it doesn't impose one-size-fits-all membership requirements, meaning that some countries have been able to negotiate bespoke terms. France, for example, remained an ally even after de Gaulle committed seemingly the ultimate deal-breaker in the mid-60s, withdrawing from NATO's integrated military command. Two other examples are even more relevant, Norway and West Germany, which both found ways to join the alliance despite, respectively, proximity to and conflict with Moscow. The Norwegian model remains relevant because it shows how a country sharing a border with Russia can join NATO by carving out targeted unilateral exceptions to mitigate the risk of hostile response from Moscow. And there's another benefit to the Norwegian model. Both former Russian President Yeltsin and Putin decried NATO expanding its membership. But when push came to shove in various negotiations, they revealed a different bottom line: opposition to NATO expanding its infrastructure, specifically military forces and weaponry, along with a block on deploying land-based intermediate and short-range missiles. The West German path to membership in 1955 is relevant for a different reason. It shows how a country can become an ally despite being divided. Now, the piece concludes by saying that given the lessons in these models, leaders of NATO members should, in private, encourage Kyiv to do three things. First, define a provisional militarily defensible border. Second, agree to self-limitations on infrastructure on unoccupied territory, with the important Norwegian disclaimer that these limits are valid only as long as Ukraine is not under attack or threat of attack. Third, and most painful, undertake not to use military force beyond that border except in self-defence, as the West Germans did, in order to assure NATO allies that they won't suddenly find themselves at war with Russia as soon as Ukraine becomes a member and Article 5 becomes the umbrella. The cost of this step would be the acceptance of open-ended division, but the benefit would be to give most of Ukraine a safe haven in NATO. Now, I quote the piece so extensively there, David, because it is these kind of conversations that must be taking place behind closed doors and which may well prove decisive in the long run for Ukraine. But the fact remains that there has been no public signal that we are close on this. And just lastly, I mentioned yesterday that Britain had reportedly given the green light for storm shadows to be used on Russian soil, a stance never officially adopted by the Conservative government, but widely believed to be in place, despite no storm shadows being used across the Russian border as yet. Well, Joe, Tony, Danielle and Daniel Martin have tried to get to the bottom of this for us, and Number 10 have been forced to clarify their position, saying that they have not given permission for Ukraine to use storm shadows to strike inside Russia. So Downing Street said that government policy hadn't changed regarding the deployment of long-range missiles, despite comments from the Prime Minister that suggested he was loosening restrictions on how the missiles are used, much to Zelensky's delight, as we reported. But a senior defence source said the situation was more nuanced than Ukraine's president had suggested. We asked the questions, and it's up to number 10 how they answer. But some are saying this is an unhelpful articulation of the British position. Lord Cameron notably said that British weapons could be used on Russian soil, which was interpreted as meaning that storm shadows would be included in those permissions. He may well, being strategically ambiguous, compelling Moscow to have to plan accordingly. Now, the new government has actually stated that it will not be granting that permission. So it could be that this is coming across as rather embarrassing on two counts. One, for the confusion, and second, for giving Putin an easy win by telling and articulating red lines. Now, I'm certain there's more to this than meets the eye, but nevertheless, it's a noteworthy story this morning, and some people are understandably seeking clarity on what exactly is this new government's position.
Let's move on. James Rothwell, thank you so much for joining us from Berlin. One story we absolutely need to talk about that you've written up for the Telegraph, and it's an assassination plot within Germany, foiled by the US and Germany. Talk to us about this story.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Very big story breaking in Germany last night, which is that CNN has revealed that a plot to assassinate Armin Papiga, the chief executive of Rheinmetall, which provides arms to Ukraine, has been foiled. That's according to 5 sources cited by CNN, US and Western sources, it says. And this caused pretty widespread shock last night. We have known for some time that Russia was launching what NATO officials call a hybrid warfare strategy in Europe. That's attempts to destabilise European democracy by meddling in elections, perhaps also trying to embarrass the country, acting on embarrassing leaks, as we saw with the conversation between German Air Force officers a few months ago about the Taurus missile that was leaked. This looks so much more serious than what's come before. And just to put a bit of context on that, we have already seen what looks like a Russian sabotage attack on the Deal arms factory in Berlin, where there was a very suspicious fire recently. We've already seen German-Russian citizens being arrested in Bavaria for allegedly plotting attacks on US military infrastructure. And this is clearly a very significant escalation based on the reports that we've seen. It's not just about attacking infrastructure or a site. It's about attacking a private citizen of a very, very important German arms company, which works basically hand in glove with NATO in order to get hundreds of thousands, potentially, of artillery shells over to Ukraine so that they can defend themselves against the Russian invasion. Now, this morning, there have been some more updates. Spiegel magazine, which tends to be very well informed, says that this plot was at a fairly advanced stage. They say that German officials were aware of suspicious movements of citizens of former Soviet states in the EU that are in the Schengen zone, the passport-free travel zone, who've been moving around. They may have gone to Dusseldorf, where the headquarters is, to carry out some spying. They may even have attempted to follow the CEO during his travel overseas as well. The details on that are not quite clear. We also don't know how exactly it was foiled. We just know it's been briefed out to CNN that the attack didn't happen. And we may get some more detail on that in the future. But the broad brush strokes of this are that Russia, according to CNN, does appear to have attempted or drawn up plans to assassinate a very senior businessman who is so closely involved in European, NATO and German support for Ukraine. A very concerning development.
Thank you, Joe, Dom, Francis and James. Now let's go to an exclusive interview with Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska. Our defence editor, Danielle Sheridan, conducted the interview in Kyiv a few weeks ago. I caught up with Danielle just to set the scene ahead of playing you the interview. Here's our conversation. Danielle, thank you so much for your time. Before we play your interview, would you start just by describing to us the setup? Where did you do it? Can you take us into your mind's eye as the reporter talking to Ukraine's First Lady?
So I'd say to initiate this interview, it took me well over a year and a half to get the okay from the First Lady's people. It involved a lot of, I would probably say, pestering from my side. I was sending a lot of requests. I really wanted to interview her. I felt it was important to show the strong woman behind a very strong man. And I finally got the okay pretty much less than a week before I went out to Ukraine. I was told to keep it really quiet. I mean, security is incredibly high there, as you can understand. So I think 2 people knew about this interview in the newsroom, and I had to keep it under wraps. I approached it with trepidation. I wasn't sure if it was actually going to come off, because this is a very busy woman and I am a British journalist. If something more pressing comes up, she's going to cancel on me and that will take priority. So I went into Ukraine wondering whether or not this would actually come off, and unfortunately it did. The interview took place on Bankova Street, which is where the office of the president is, and it's a really unusual place to be because once upon a time it was thronging with people, it was open to the public, and now it's closed. The only people you'll see walking around are security officials and policemen, and outside lots of the rooms it's like a complex of lots of different buildings, and as you enter any room, there are sandbags and lights are turned off, and it's this real contrast between a really beautiful building inside with lovely artwork and furniture and beautifully painted rooms. I mean, the one we were sat in was pastel pink. It was crazy then to have it juxtaposed with sandbags outside the staircase that we came up. But I guess the reflection of what it's like to be operating and working in a war zone.
What did you make of her as a person?
I liked her. I know as journalists we should not be biased and we should try and be clear-eyed and not really have an opinion on someone. You're just there to get the story. She's shy and she's likeable. She's not arrogant. She is not someone who has grown up with her career in the public eye. She's always been behind the scenes. Before she became the First Lady of Ukraine, she was a comedy script writer. She's very funny, she's witty, she's intelligent, she is composed, and yeah, she's likeable. And I just found myself rooting for her. And this is also a woman who quite literally has the weight of the world on her shoulders. She is married to a man who is Putin's number one enemy. Her family has been torn apart. She doesn't have the support of her husband because it's her and the kids and him living apart. And she's also representing on the world stage. I think she's a really remarkable person. And off-screen a lot was said that made me really warm to her, but even how she handled herself throughout the interview, which was obviously when it was all very professional, we just spoke about the questions I had in mind, she articulated herself in a very genuine way. I got the impression that she was really considering what she had to say and was not giving pre-prepared answers. It felt like I was engaged in a really authentic conversation with her and that I was getting truthful answers, which is all you can really hope for as a journalist. I'm so used to having done interviews with people where they need to toe a party line, or I've interviewed a lot of people in the military where they're so conditioned to not say anything that the MOD would disapprove of, that you are just given some boring jargon that makes it really hard to not only write a compelling interview but get to know that person. And I felt so privileged to be sat talking to this person who is so important and busy, and yet be given actual genuine responses and not just fobbed off with some banal commentary.
Well, Danielle, let's hear it. Here's your interview with Olena Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine.
Olena Zelenska, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me. I'm Danielle Sheridan, the defence editor at the Daily Telegraph, and I know how busy you are, so we're really grateful to have your time. I guess I wanted to start by asking you, it's been more than 2 years since the full-blown invasion. Are you worried that war fatigue is going to settle in? And are you concerned that there might be countries in the West that stop paying as much attention to this war as it continues to drag on?
Of course, we hope this war fatigue doesn't settle. Existentially for us, actually, because our existence depends on it. Yes, of course, sometimes we're worried that the aid is arriving slower than we expected, or not in the amounts we expected, but still it arrives. And I'm sure our true friends will never give up on us. We hope for this.
This year, you will be hosting the Summit of First Ladies and Gentlemen again. Is that another opportunity to keep this fatigue at bay?
Well, probably, yes. Now, I also use these gatherings to unite friends around us. But remembering how we founded this platform, of course, it wasn't created for that. We wanted to unite the activities of spouses and the first persons of the state. And in fact, there is much more in common between us than it may seem at first glance. Each of us is a public figure. We have a lot of common themes that we are all working on. In fact, humanitarian problems in all corners of the world are almost the same. And this year we also plan a summit. It should take place again in Kyiv. I'm definitely very happy about that. And on the 12th of September, this time we will also discuss a common topic for all of us, which concerns us very much. This will be a theme about the safety of children. And in short, what are we going to talk about? We will look at this problem from several perspectives. The first perspective is relevant to Ukraine. It's the perspective of war. Unfortunately, we understand that children are the very first victims of any war or military conflict. The militarization of children, their abduction, the death of children. The problem is that children don't have access to medical care and education. All this applies to children not only in Ukraine, but also, for example, in Palestine and Israel, African countries where military conflicts arise from time to time. In any place where there are weapons, the first victims are always children. The second perspective that we'll discuss is the safety of children in the family. Unfortunately, the mental health of parents and the family as a whole, divorce, parental kidnapping, many other problems can prevent a child from feeling safe in their own family. The third perspective is school. And from this perspective, we'll discuss not only a safe school environment and how a child can be physically safe at school, but also safety from the psychological state of the student and teacher, how safe the process of education is. And lastly, we will look into the topic of the safety of children on the internet. It's a topic that becomes increasingly heated every year. It's about cyberbullying, disinformation, misinformation online, how we can continue, for example, to develop digital education, which is sometimes the key to continuing education as a whole. Right now in Ukraine, almost half of the children only learn online.
Майже половина дітей вчиться тільки онлайн.
Do you hope then that one day, soon, children won't be relying online for education and will be back in schools? I know you've spoken previously about schools aren't necessarily safe because they don't have bunkers, shelters, and there's indiscriminate bombing. What is the answer to that?
Але ми не можемо чекати.
Well, sure. The key for the children to simply, safely return to schools 100% is for the war to end. But we can't wait, because we don't know how long we'll have to wait. Yes, we fight for our existence, but we cannot tell any child in our country when it will stop, unfortunately. So as adults, we have to try to continue the education process with the same means that are available to us at this point. The first option is to continue online education in the regions where physically attending school is impossible. These are frontline regions: Zaporizhia Oblast, Kherson Oblast, some parts of Mykolaiv Oblast, and Kharkiv Oblast, where the shells reach very quickly if there is artillery shelling or rockets, and the children won't have the time to get to the shelters. In other regions of Ukraine, we need to arrange safe shelters in schools. The more shelters there are, the more children will be able to comfortably continue their education. Now there are more. I understand that in peaceful times this would sound completely absurd, but we're looking into the possibility of building projects such as underground schools. In Kharkiv, one school like this has already been built. And I know that several frontline regions are also looking into projects like this because the situation is really critical. We have children who will go into the 3rd grade who have never met their classmates, only seen them on a tablet screen. And this, of course, doesn't contribute to socialization of children that is so crucial, especially for elementary school children to communicate with their peers. And they're losing that opportunity because of the war. So to cherish education in Ukraine further, we try to resort to any solutions available. Of course, we hope that one day all of our children will go safely to their schools, because they'll know that there is no threat to us anymore. That is our greatest dream now.
Тому що будуть знати, що нам більше нічого не загрожує. Це найбільша мрія для нас зараз.
If we look then to America, we've got the presidential election coming up. President Trump could be back in power, and he has made comments about how he could end the war in Ukraine. Does that concern you?
І так, нас це бентежить, але знову ж таки.
Of course, a lot depends on the American elections, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire world. And yes, we are concerned. But again, there's no way we can influence that. We don't have the right. So I don't even want to, go deep into this topic, because I'm not sure it's up to me to give political comments like that. I'm not a diplomat. I don't have a mandate to make statements on behalf of Ukraine. At the same time, as the wife of the president, some of my words may be perceived as his thoughts or the opinion of the official Ukrainian leadership. So I'm not going to comment on that. Of course, we are following events with great interest. We worry, and that's all we can do now.
Все, що ми можемо зараз робити.
So speaking of being the wife of the president, what is it like to be married to President Zelensky?
Ну, ми більшу частину все ж таки свого життя прожили.
Well, we've spent the majority of life as husband and wife when he wasn't president. So thank God on our family life, his presidency didn't influence that much on our relationship. We've been together for way too long for that. Of course, it's not easy. It wasn't my choice, and everyone knows that it was his decision. Then I had to choose whether to work as the wife of the president or to go into the shadows. I chose the first option, and when you make the choice to have an active role, you treat it as your job. This is my job now. But of course, nobody would ever want to be the wife of a president of a country at war. It's a huge responsibility. You have to understand that people look at you and you have to support them. You have to give them hope and confidence regardless of your emotional state that day. You have to be a support for people, and sometimes it really is hard, but other times it's really inspiring when you see people support you back. I feel such gratitude, to be honest. It is worth it. It is worth the work. Our family life is very complicated right now because we don't live together. Predominantly, he lives in the office and the children and I live separately. Of course, we want that to change because a family needs a normal life. The children need their father more often than they get to see him. And I think he's getting tired of this lifestyle. This is not how it should be. But then you remember that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Ukrainians are living in the same way, separated, waiting for each other. Some are on the front line. Then you can't complain. At least we get to see each other.
Ми хоча б можемо бачити одного.
How has your family and your marriage coped with the strains that this war has put on it? Have you had marriage counselling or therapy together? You know, other couples go through a lot less and seek those kind of tools for help. What have you done to help?
Ну, чесно скажу,
If I'm honest, now in our relationship, everything is good. I don't know why. Maybe because we need each other more because of all these trials we're put through. Or maybe because we see each other less frequently and we always have something to tell each other. We don't bore each other, that's for sure. We miss each other and we don't have time to make each other angry or have a fight. So lately we almost never fight. Unfortunately, I think it's one of the features that we would like to change, our society's perception of psychology. That people should turn to a specialist for their problems. But this isn't in our culture yet. If people are starting to feel more positive about individual consultations, with more appreciation that starts happening, more people are turning to specialists. This is one of the many lines of work that we need to do in our society. But couples counselling, we still need to talk about. Very few people believe that it works. Yes, we see it in movies and we understand that it's more a Western cultural story, but I'm confident we need to develop that along with other routines for people to take care of themselves. I hope that Volodymyr and I won't need that therapy.
Сподіваюся, що нам з Володимиром ця терапія не знадобиться.
You spoke a lot about mental health. How is your mental health?
Ну, мені важко оцінити свою власну ментальність.
It's hard for me to assess my own mental health. Probably before I started actively being involved with my colleagues in the all-Ukrainian mental health program, I knew less about the entire topic. The more you dive deeper, the more you start to think about your own state too. And all the recommendations that we give within our How Are You program, I try to apply it to myself and try to somehow analyse what I feel and what state I'm in. There are moments where I feel I am close to psychological burnout and I understand that I need to rest. So I try to use that moment effectively, because sometimes when we think we have rest, we don't. Even a day spent in a family circle can help you get back on your feet. Of course, I try not to do the things that may deprive me of my mental balance. It's hard not to read the news before you go to bed, or not to read Telegram channels at night when the air raid siren sounds, and we all try to understand what's flying where. But sometimes when I have an opportunity, I try to put my phone away before I go to bed. I try to use all these fundamental pieces of advice to maintain my mental health. I hope to live until the moment of the victory in a sane state of mind. This is my dream, not to come to this so exhausted that we won't be able to be happy about it.
Настільки знесиленими, що не могли породіти.
Have you got any particular coping mechanisms that you've learned? You said you try every so often not to look at your phone before bed. Is there anything else that has really helped you?
I already know myself. I understand that when I'm feeling bad, I'm exhausted, I have to do some physical exercise. Sport calms me down, it gives me strength. How paradoxical it is that when you exert yourself physically, your emotional strength grows. But I can't say this is my recipe. I look at my husband, who has been coping like this for several years now, and I've always wondered how he had the strength after a super difficult week. On Saturday and Sunday, he would still do some training because he felt that brings him back to his feet. And this is my recipe now too. This isn't the only thing I learned from him, but one of the most practical ones, and I'm grateful to him for that.
Is that a kind of a psychological technique you've learned throughout this war to compartmentalize perhaps your thoughts to survive?
Не знаю, мені здається, складно знайти якусь особливу техніку.
I don't know. I think it's hard to find some sort of special technique. If you're scared, you're scared. There isn't much you can do about it. It all depends on the character of the person. We have 3 types of people, 3 typical types of reactions to a terrible event. Fight, flight, hide, and freeze. Some people are trying to strike back, others to run away, and the third hide. They can't move. I think that I'm 100% not the third type. I understand that when I'm scared, I need to physically do something. I can compile a list of things that calm me down, and I'll go and do those things. Sometimes it's cleaning. This is a recipe for many women I know in the world to calm down. Just if you don't know what to do, just go wash your hair. While you're doing something mechanically, physically, you don't just sit idly and be scared. You do something helpful at this moment. I think this is one of the recipes.
Мені здається, це один з рецептів.
I think that's sound advice. Well, we've spoken about books, so I would love to hear a bit more about your Ukrainian bookshelf project.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk about the idea that more books will be translated into the Ukrainian language. And I also know that you have made a point of speaking in Ukrainian more and more. And I wondered, I know you grew up speaking Russian. Do you still use that language? And how does it feel to speak Russian?
Я розпочну з книжкової полички, з проєкту.
I'll start with the bookshelf project. It started before the full-scale invasion. It was a project aimed at popularizing the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian philosophical ideas, Ukrainian literature. We tried to fill in bookshelves in libraries around the world with our literature, translated or in Ukrainian, for people to learn more about us. And during the full-scale invasion, it became more of a tool of resistance. Because when fake information is constantly being made about you and your history's been twisted, you have to respond. If you can't take weapons into your hands, you can use books. And books are often our friends in moments like that. Regarding Ukrainian and Russian language, unfortunately, when I was born, I didn't get to choose the language I would be taught to speak. Now I would feel much better than I do if we didn't have past like that. These were the consequences of the Russian and then Soviet Empire, the Russification of everything. When you could only get higher education in Russian, obviously generation after generation of people who break through somewhere in life, they spoke Russian more and more. Now, for many of us, first of all, this period is over, thank God. And now there is a reverse tendency in Ukraine. You cannot, without knowing Ukrainian, consider yourself an educated person, finally. After 2014, there was a reconsideration of our history and our place on the map of Europe, and language has become an even stronger marker of belonging. I can't say I immediately made my decision to switch into Ukrainian, because some sort of inertia continued, especially when you live in an environment where lots of people speak Russian. But I've always loved Ukrainian literature and language, so it wasn't too hard for me to switch completely to Ukrainian. Right now, to be honest, I mostly communicate in Ukrainian. I try to do it in my household, and I always respond in Ukrainian. even if asked in Russian. Everybody around understands everything, so it's easy. Maybe once in a while I may just use an automatic word, but it's just unpleasant right now to speak Russian, because it's the language of the people who came to kill us. And so to be different from them and to have nothing in common with them, I think it's important not to speak their language. At the same time, strategically, it's normal that we understand it, because you need to know your enemy's language to better understand how to resist. There is this huge bonus that they don't fully understand us, but we do understand them perfectly.
Бонус те, що вони нас не розуміють до кінця, ми їх розуміємо дуже добре.
Okay, we've talked so much about books, and I did have more questions about literature. I feel like we've probably kind of covered it, but my question was, do you have a favourite book? And also, we did kind of talk about it earlier, but does reading provide you with escapism?
А ви знаєте, тут є така парадокс психологічний.
You know, there's some sort of psychological paradox. It's probably the same thing when people watch horror movies. When you read or watch something horrible, you understand that this isn't real life, and maybe it's easier for you to take in what's happening around you. So after the beginning of the large war, I caught myself reading things I would stop reading previously because I was scared. For instance, I read with pleasure once again Orwell's 1984. I don't like the dystopian genre, but at that point in the first months of the war, I needed that. I needed to read it once again and see how awful the fall of the society may be. I think this is more about Russia. This is definitely about them. This is about how people can lose touch with reality. And maybe reading helps me to react less emotionally to the news on the other side. Because when you see how much the brains of the citizens of the neighbouring country have been manipulated, your first reaction is just, you can't understand how that's possible. But then you recall Orwell and you come to realise that everything is possible.
Можливо, все не треба зважати.
You seem like a really courageous, together person. And we've just spoken a lot about mental health. Do you ever have those moments where you wake up in the middle of the night and you just think, I can't cope? And what do you do?
Кілька разів, признаюся, було, коли це були найстрашніші якісь моменти.
A couple of times, I have to admit, those were the most horrifying moments. And it's good it happened at night because none of my children saw it, because I always have to be a source of confidence for them. Children always look up to their parents, and they need to know that everything is going to be okay. A couple of times I allowed myself to cry when it was unbearably sad, but it was something I did consciously because I know sometimes I need to dive deep to the bottom to find the power to push and then swim again. You have to allow yourself an opportunity to cry all out. I can say these are very rare things with me. There are always things to be happy about, even in the most horrifying moments. We still see the manifestation of humanity, and this is incredibly inspiring. The most horrifying moments when we witness the rescuers searching the rubble of residential buildings, and we see people retrieved from there. I see in photos the faces of the rescuers who arrive on site, and I'm incredibly grateful to those people. I look at how concentrated they are and how they work, and this heroic deed of many people every day, it inspires me even in the worst moments. And it doesn't let you succumb to discouragement because you realize you did so little to get tired, that you need to go and keep working.
Щоб настільки втомитися, що треба йти і працювати далі.
I can assure you, you haven't done so little. On that note, thank you so much for sitting down. It was brilliant to talk to you.
Well, Danielle, that was the interview. Can I ask, before we go to your final thoughts, what did you go in looking for in that interview, and what do you think you came out with?
For me, being able to interview Olena, I wanted to know what makes her tick. I wanted to know more about her as a woman, what it's like to be married to the president of Ukraine, what it's like being a mother and a person on the international stage. I didn't want to know about weapons that Ukraine needs and how she thinks troops are faring and the military strategic side of things. That wasn't what I was interested in. And to be honest, my whole take on reporting on war has always been the people, because you will always have weapons and statements from the Ministry of Defence and pleas from President Zelensky for more ammunition, wings, money, tanks. But you're also going to have the regular human beings that are caught in the crossfire of war. And for me, it's always been about people. That's made reporting on war so unique, so personally moving. And I think that's why I wanted to get to interview her, because if I got the chance to interview President Zelensky, I know exactly what we would be talking about. It would be the kit, the military, what the West needs to be doing, how to better help Ukraine. And I wanted to get to that personal side. And for me, I felt it was a powerful interview, because those kind of questions, I think, often get pushed to the side because they're seen as soft. But in my experience, soft can be very powerful.
And Danielle, just finally, you are getting married, I believe next week, is that right? Congratulations. You and Zelenska talked about it a little bit, we had a discussion beforehand, and you mentioned, and she gave you some fantastic advice for a happy marriage. What was it?
Okay, so we did get on really well off camera. She is really nice. As I said, I warmed to her, and she was admiring some jewellery I had on my hand. And I said to her, well, what's the key for a happy marriage? And she told me that a successful marriage is based on being friends with your partner beforehand, which I thought was really lovely, and also pretty cool that the First Lady of Ukraine gave me some marriage advice.
Will that be coming up in either of the speeches in the next few weeks?
Well, I've just done the massive name drop now, so probably not. But also another little snippet, I bought her a book from the UK. I wanted to give a piece of literature to her because I know that she's an avid reader, and given her background in comedy writing, I bought her the collection of works from my favourite British writer, Aphra Behn, and she was famously a brilliant comedy writer herself. She's renowned as one of the great satirical writers that the UK ever produced. And anyway, I went to Hatchard, which is I think I'm right in saying is London's oldest bookshop. They wrapped this book up really beautifully in like brown paper, green ribbons. I was really chuffed to give it to her, but her security guards took it off me and just ripped it apart because they wanted to make sure it wasn't anything dangerous. So then actually what she got handed from me was just some tatty book, which was quite funny after going to such lengths to get this beautifully prepared book. But she said that she was very grateful for it. She said that reading is a form of escapism, and I really hope that at some point in her life she does take time to sit down and read it, because Aphra Behn really is a beautiful writer. And actually I'd urge anyone to go away and read the works of Aphra Behn.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for your time. Let's move now at the end of this week, at the end of a historic NATO summit, to our final thoughts. Dom Nicholls, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, David. So a couple on messaging, really. I note and agree with Francis's comment there earlier on about how perception is everything, and the gaffe, particularly the Putin-Zelensky gaffe from Joe Biden, could well be the end of it. I think it's going to be a very busy weekend. I note the long commentary about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the former US president back early 20th century, who was in a wheelchair because of his polio. And it was said that actually if the public had seen him, there'd been more images, certainly if there'd been the media landscape of today, and the people had seen him looking very physically frail, then he might not have been voted in for, well, he was 4 terms, I think he had, didn't he? So he was voted in three times. Died in office, yeah. So, yeah, the power of the image and the power of the narrative. So whilst all the reports I've seen, Joe's absolutely spot on, that the rest of the press conference Biden seemed to handle with aplomb. It's that moment that we're going to remember. And just on the power of the message, just in the last half hour, actually, I note the Kyiv Independent, citing Russian pro-state outlet Gazeta RU, are reporting that Moscow is planning to block YouTube in Russia from September. Yet another clampdown on access to free speech and any kind of speech. So if you're in Russia now, you can still see David Francis and myself on our Defence in Depth videos on YouTube, so get busy downloading. Some you'll find slightly more interesting than the others, if you're not a Napoleon fan. But yeah, do go and have a look at YouTube whilst you can.
Thank you very much, Dom. Francis Dearnley.
Well, thanks, David. I'm not going to respond to Dom's critique there of my Defence in Depth episode on Napoleon, although I will say that one of the top comments I seem to remember was, I much prefer this fella than the other chap. So read into that what one will. So I wanted to end today with an interesting reflective thread from Michael Kaufman, Senior Fellow of the Carnegie Endowment. He's published this on X, formerly known as Twitter, of course, and some interesting reflections. So he says, I've just finished a recent field study in Ukraine, and these are my conclusions. And he goes on, I'm reading them now. Ukraine faces difficult months of fighting ahead, but the situation at the front is better than it was this spring. More worrisome is the state of Ukraine's air defence and the damage from Russian strikes to the power grid. Ukraine's manpower, fortifications and ammunition situation is steadily improving. Russian forces have not been able to exploit the Kyiv offensive into a major breakthrough. That front has stabilised. Despite, however, the improved outlook, rectifying manpower deficits will take time. Russian forces are likely to keep advancing over the coming months, especially in Donetsk. The next 2 months will be especially difficult. A change in US policy on weapons employment enabled Ukraine to push Russian S-300s used to bombard the city away from Kyiv. This brought the city breathing space and forced Russia to make adjustments, although the offensive had ultimately culminated by that point. Ukraine is very low on ammunition for legacy Soviet systems, whereas Russian drone and missile production rates have increased significantly. A deficit of air defence has led to pervasive Russian reconnaissance behind the front line and increased success rates in strikes. Russian glide bomb strikes have become more accurate and from greater ranges. They destroy entire positions and are more psychologically impactful than artillery. Quite a remarkable statement, that. Now, the promise of additional Patriot batteries and Hawks plus rerouting of missile exports to Ukraine can make a big difference this year. That said, pushing Patriot batteries forward to tackle Russian airstrikes will be risky if they themselves cannot be protected. He then goes on and talks about Western munitions ratios, saying that it's relative parity, 1-1, in the Kharkiv front, but elsewhere it's 5-1 and declining. After the passage of new mobilisation laws, he said, there is a significantly higher intake of men, but there is a lag effect. The number of volunteers has also increased, but again, it will take time, and the MOD is working to revamp the image of the service, opening recruitment centres, and obviously, I imagine also as part of that, trying to stop the images of people being taken against their will in order to serve in the armed forces. And just finally, in what is an interesting thread, and I'm having to summarise it here in a more condensed form, he stresses again how crippled Ukraine's non-nuclear energy generation is, and says that in summer, Ukraine has been getting energy thanks to solar. But when that shuts off, it's going to be extremely dangerous and probably the hardest winter yet. Ukraine, he says, needs 16 gigawatts this winter. Optimistically, it will be able to produce 12 gigawatts, and that is assuming only at current ratios. So an interesting thread from somebody who's just been on the ground and is looking at very specific issues that, of course, are fault lines in the war at the moment on the military front. But some good news in terms of an improving position in various elements. I think now the debate we were having perhaps a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, about whether the worst had passed in terms of the danger of a breakthrough, I think that has been answered now. But again, it remains to be seen whether there is still possibility of some quite sizable advantages playing out for Russia in the short to medium term, particularly in terms of those missile strikes on energy infrastructure. But an interesting thread which we'll link to in the show notes.
Thank you very much, Francis. And if listeners do want to hear a more in-depth interview on Ukraine's energy crisis as a result of Russian bombing, I'd recommend the interview we did last week. I believe we published it last Thursday with Dmitry Sakharuk from DTEK. That's Ukraine's largest private energy company. And we spoke to him for about 20-25 minutes about the impact of missile strikes, plans for generation, and how they might come back from this. And it was quite a sobering interview. So I'd recommend that, and we'll put it in the show notes. Joe Barnes, at the end of this NATO summit, which we opened today's episode with talk to us about your final thoughts.
Final thoughts, leaving Washington, lots got done. Let's not, as I said in my opening gambit, let's not let Joe Biden's gaffes look at the more serious issues. I think the White House have actually put out a tick list. There's probably about a dozen ticks that they think talking about more NATO resolve, looking at things like hybrid warfare and stuff. There's loads of things have been achieved, but it is going to be overshadowed by this moment. But yeah, let's dive deeper into the successes, especially when it comes to supporting Ukraine. I think membership ultimately is going to be a great goal for Ukraine. Article 5 is a massive clause for them in terms of mutual defence. But what has always been clear is while there is a border dispute, or as NATO people call it, but let's call it what it is, the full-scale invasion, a war going on, that membership isn't going to happen. So actually, by Ukraine now receiving extra Patriot batteries or parts of the Patriot batteries, that's actually moving them closer to the 7 Patriots that I think Zelensky and co said they needed. There's apparently dozens of other systems going in. So it's actually acted as a real moment for NATO allies to come together and actually address the pressing issues, the here and now, when membership is not actually on the table properly. So yeah, I think everyone can come away with their head held high that they've helped Ukraine. Obviously, they can do more. They should do more. But given the politics in France, in America here, where it makes doing more hard at times, people are pulling through. So don't let Joe Biden's gaffe overshadow what has been a successful summit.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.